As you've heard in announcements I've made recently, there's a UU program entitled Wellspring, which I have participated in for 2 years. The second year focused, on spiritual practices. And one of the topics we explored was generosity. Just to clarify, today's not about fundraising or pledge week. Those are important, but this is more about a discussion of generosity as a spiritual practice. As I announced last week and posted on the What's Happening newsletter, I hope you've considered these 2 questions and are ready to share your thoughts. This is exactly how they were presented to me, to the group, to my Wellspring group, and we were asked to consider them and then reflect on what they conjured up in our minds. So I hope some of you have had a chance to think about these, and we'll begin our sort of square circle here, as well as ask the folks on Zoom to join in. So Randy, I guess this is a time to go to if you've all had a chance to look at I'll read them just to get them in our minds. What was the prevailing sense of money in your family? Was there scarcity or abundance? What did you learn about generosity, both financial and power, from your family? That is, generosity in financial terms and generosity in sharing power with others. So now maybe we can go to that gallery view, and I'd love to hear from some folks here in the sanctuary. We've relocated the microphone that hears you, and hopefully will bring what you have to say to the folks who are joined virtually. And there they are. So, anyone want to start? Judy, thank you.
Well, since you posted those or talked about those questions last week, I gave it a lot of thought and ended up having to call my sister to make sure that I hadn't missed, something in all this. And basically, we got by. I don't think I ever, as a child, thought about it other than when my father's sisters married wealthies. We would go visit those cousins, and they actually had a freezer in the basement with popsicles, and you could go get one anytime you wanted. And that to me was abundance that we didn't have. But my father worked in a shoe factory. Everything was wonderful until 1952, when all the mills and factories moved south. My dad went from 5 days to 3 days to 1 day. We packed up a homemade trailer and drove across the country looking for a job. 3 kids and a dog who got car happy after 1 day on the road, and ended up, for some awful reason, in Texas, where my dad got a job. I don't think, we knew not to ask for things. We were fed, we had a roof over our head. It was only in comparison when we felt like it to other people. But I think families have a tendency to be friends with people in their same situation. And once we left the wealthy cousins behind, I don't think it ever dawned on us again. So, and I can say I checked, my sister had the same thing, except she's younger. She didn't even remember the reason why we left New England on this search for a job. She just thought it was a lark. So, anyway.
I'll restrain from commenting until we have a few more reflections. Anyone else want to share theirs? Yeah, Wayne, please.
My parents each came from poor backgrounds, and even though we had a lower middle class life because of my father's occupation, I had very frugal um, view of things. I've always been cautious about success and so on. Abundance was never an issue.
Thank you, Wayne. I don't see a hand up on our Zoom folks yet, so Janet?
Yeah, I have probably a pretty typical story. I was born in the early 50s. My parents grew up during the Depression, and even though they did quite well as adults, we never had trouble with money problems. We were very extraordinarily cautious with money. Particularly my mother's family lost everything in the Great Depression. They both lived in the Midwest. So there was a lot of caution around money, and big expenditures were taken very carefully. It wasn't lightly taken. Anytime you made a big purchase, it was deeply concerning, and you had to imagine how this would impact your savings, and that's the way I was raised. Very cautious.
Margaret.
I was born in the pit of the Depression, and my dad was a game warden, and he was lucky he had never been unemployed. And first time sometime in the 20s, he got a job with the Postal Service, which still in the game warden business. So he was employed all the way through the Depression. So my mother felt that we were very middle class. Well, and then when I was 5, there was a serious car accident, and we had to to the hospital for a week. And Dad discovered that his insurance policy had just lapsed. So he had no insurance. So he was paying regularly on that accident until I was 16. So money was always tight. But my mother said we're middle class. So I assumed we were. And middle class would get involved.
Okay. Should I get in the camera? I'm not in the camera. Let me move my chair so that I can at least be one of the blurry things here. There we go. I never even thought about abundance when I was growing up. I never gave it a single thought, except maybe in religious terms, because I had the images of the banquet that you have after your death, with Jesus and in heaven, and heaven, but never had any images of that. And I remember my mother never discussed finances with me whatsoever, and so I never thought about. I mean, she was pretty frugal, but I never thought about being wealthy or poor. We had what we needed, and she was really tight with, she wouldn't talk about finances at all with me.
I'll throw mine in. And it's interesting, I'm realizing that we're all more or less of a generation, and that certainly affects our attitudes. And we're also all UUs, so that's beginning to show a pattern of where we came from. But my parents also grew up in the Depression and remembered it vividly and shared stories of it. But I don't remember, as a kid, I don't remember being at all horrified or concerned by that. Those stories were kind of like adventures. They were like pioneers. They were fun examples of overcoming challenges. One which probably isn't exactly accurate, but I remember my mom discussing how they had no coffee when coffee was being rationed, and I guess that was during World War II. And they would take the coffee grinds that they had, wet, used, bring them up to the roof of their building and dry them in the sun, and then bring them back down and make another pot from them, as if the flavors were stored by the sun. They would dry out, but I doubt that it was very good coffee, but she told that story. My dad was very frugal, but with joy. He took great joy in being frugal. We would moan and groan as we'd drive down the street And he'd see things in people's garbage, and he'd pull over the car and grab a broken television or an old radio that someone else had thrown out, and he'd bring it home and he'd fix it. And back in the days when TVs had tubes, you could do things like that. And he took such joy out of maybe spraying the tuner or replacing a tube, and suddenly we had another TV. We had a TV in every room in the house because of the joy that he took in being frugal, but not out of anger, out of a joy of making things work. So I inherited a lot of that more positive attitude, frugal, but not angry about it. Frugal out of an appreciation for making the most with what you got. And my mom, everyone mentioned their moms. My mom kept the books, just like Mimi does in my world. I can't stand it. And she seems to get joy out of that. I get none. But my mom kept a ledger. You remember those crazy big pages with, I know Janet, we've talked about it. And, tiny little numbers that she would spend hours at her desk, I guess. As a kid, again, I didn't count the hours. I just knew that was something Mom did in this magical book that was kind of cool because no one else had a book like that. Again, no expression of concern. The only time I remember my parents expressing a financial kind of thing was because my mom's sister married a pretty wealthy construction company owner. They owned buildings, and so they were well off. They were better off than we were. And I have to admit that sometimes she was a little bit, not bitter, but she would criticize them for being spendthrifts, for being, what's a better word? Yeah. And that, oh, you don't need to buy a Cadillac, a Chevy's good enough kind of thing. But, so I did have that, but I love my cousins and I love my aunt, so I never let it affect my love for them. Who else would like to say something?
Mary Ann, could you please unmute yourself?
Mary Ann.
Share.
Hi, guys. I grew up in a fairly affluent neighborhood in Westchester, and everybody was concerned about climbing socially and joining the country club and that kind of thing. And we were middle class, and we were not social climbers. And so I was at first sort of intimidated by all of that money. But when we wanted something, we had to earn it. I wanted a pair of boots at the French bootery, and I had to babysit and make my money and buy those boots with my own money. My mother set a very, very fine example of being frugal. I had a tendency to, when I had a dime in my pocket, I'd spend it, but or I'd give it away. But we were comfortable, but there was always somebody who had something better, and I don't think it intimidated me. It kind of frustrated me because I eventually realized how unimportant that was. And that's why I left the area. But we were comfortable. We had what we needed, and we were frugal. My mother particularly, because they did grow up during the Depression, and she told a story about when she was a young girl, and she took a little slab of butter and put it on her plate and didn't finish it. And my grandfather slammed his fist on the table and said, "Do you realize some people don't have any food, and you're not eating that butter that you took?" And even when she was old, my mother we'd go to a restaurant and she'd take the sugar packets and stick them in her pocket. I said, "Mother, I'll buy you sugar." She said, "Why? They're free. They're free." So we were both, but I was never really swept up into that social climbing aspect, which I found ugly.
I have a question. So in your Wellspring group, did you experience? We do agree we're all kind of the same generational. Our parents came out of the Depression. Did you have younger people in that group, and did they have different experiences?
Great question. I'm sorry to say, my Wellspring group is kind of similar to this. We actually have one woman who's, Margaret's age, and so has a little bit more history, but similar experiences. So no, I can't speak to that. There are certainly groups that have younger folks in them, and that would be really interesting to hear. I don't think I've run these questions by my kids. We talk about issues all the time, so I kind of know what they'd say, but I'm curious to know what they'd say specifically to address these questions. Art!
Well,
Anita, please unmute yourself and share.
I'm sorry, Randy, I got Art and then I guess Anita.
Oh, okay.
Oh, or Anita first. What a gentleman.
You are a gentleman.
Anita, go ahead. Let's hear.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I grew up in a family with abundance and frugality. So I'm just sharing a story about my maternal grandma who lived in East Germany. He owned a cigar and a cigarette store and with some stationery. And so she woke up very early in the morning, around 4 o'clock, and she left home with a thermal, and she went into the shop and sold cigars and cigarettes to the workers who went to take a train at a closed train station. And so my grandma was able to save like $2,000 during the years. And she gave it to my mom, but my mom was not allowed to take it out of East Germany. So she was clever. She put the money in her bra, and we kids, we were so nervous about that issue that we thought on the border they will keep her. And so, but it didn't happen. And so my mom was able to change the money, the currency to Swiss francs and buy us things. So that's my little story. Thank you.
And I see you tell it with a smile on your face, Anita, so all of those memories bring joy.
Yes,
Which is great. All right.
Well, you know, I guess I came from a sort of an upper middle class family. And money wasn't discussed a lot, other than the fact that there was a long family legacy of extreme generosity. And so I always kept that as something that's part of my soul and my heart. And so I personally was incredibly broke. I mean, I was destitute beyond destitute. And so one day, my remote but very wealthy uncle had passed away and invited us to his funeral. Well, at the end of the funeral, his sons, my first cousins, came up and handed me a package, an envelope, rather. And I said, yabba dabba doo, the train's finally come. What's he going to do with all this money? Well, I opened it up and it was a handkerchief. And I never knew Bob that had any particular interest in a handkerchief, but I didn't know what to do with it because it was sort of a sentimental thing. But about 2 years later, when I had one hell of a cold, I really appreciated his generosity. That's my story. That's generosity.
I want to remind us all of the second question, which is a little bit of a variation. What did you learn about generosity, both financial and power, from your family? In other words, sharing financially, but also sharing the concept of sharing power, assuming that your family felt they were empowered in any way. And I'm reminded, I didn't think about this until right now, but when I grew up, we had a cleaning lady. Her name was Olivia, which is my granddaughter's name. And Olivia was black. She would come to us once a week or once a month, I can't remember that. But a van would pull up in front of our house, and it was full of ladies from not the city, but from from towns on the South Shore where mostly African American people lived. They'd drop Olivia off, she'd work all day at our house, and then get back on the van and go back to her home. And I remember her as a little kid. What I learned later on as an adult was that my parents, that agency that delivered Olivia, didn't pay any Social Security, didn't provide any benefits. They just dropped people off, and she had to pay them. So they found the jobs, and then they charged the people who were working. My parents got Olivia to enroll in Social Security. They gave her a raise so that she could contribute to Social Security and become employed. Not too long after that, she started driving a car rather than being delivered by the van. And over the course of my childhood, she became much better off. So I realize now that was a pretty cool thing for my parents to do. I don't know what the details were, but I do know that much. In a sense, that's sharing financially, but more importantly, sharing power. Not supremacy, but the privilege that we enjoy, thanks to the color of our skin and our economic status, is a power that we can learn to share if taught. So any thoughts on that, either question like that? Judy?
As far as generosity goes, the actual, giving out money, that I don't remember that ever happening in my family. My mother was a blood donor, gave as much as she could all the time, but in the same correlation story there as far as power. I remember, of course, we were living in Texas, and one day this little black boy was at our front door and he was crying. And of course, he lived across the tracks. There was the black neighborhood, and we were far south. And he was crying, and he had been selling subscriptions to the Fort Worth Star, to the local newspaper. And there's a gentleman that lived 3 houses down who hated who's. And when this little black boy had knocked on his door, this guy picked him up and threw him off his porch. And in the process of doing this, the little boy lost his notebook or whatever he'd been, collecting people to buy for the paper. So he's standing on our front porch crying. And so my dad puts him in the car, drives to the north side of town where you normally didn't go, dropped the little boy off. And later, my father managed, scrounging around in my neighbor's yard, found this little notebook and drove back to the north part of town and handed it off to somebody and said, try to find this young man. And to me, that is more generosity than handing out money, because I'll always remember my dad doing that. And this was foreign territory, you have to remember. They weren't allowed to swim in our swimming pool. They didn't have one. They got to watch us swim if they ventured to our side of town. I lived in a pretty segregated part of the country for years. But anyway, I've always been proud of my dad for that.
We just have a couple more minutes to devote to this. Anyone else in our virtual world with a raised hand? Oh, Jeff. Randy, are you good for Jeff or?
Jeff, you're next.
Hi. Thanks. I hadn't really particularly raised my hand. I was just applauding Judy for her statements, mostly with my little symbols and all that kind of thing. But since you've asked me, I have more opinions than experience, I think, on a lot of this. I find that a lot of economics, of course, is often well wrapped in politics, for good or ill. And I think we're heading towards a lot of revolution in that regard, or how we handle our economics, both monetarily. I think money is going to become more of a credit system, which It comes in cryptocurrency and things like that. And we're going to be having less actual money, which is harder to track for governments and things. So it will become a more honest system, but a less flexible system, I think. However, I think that when we have, as you were mentioning, Andy, greater pools of money that we can share in our communities, the community itself becomes more generous, I find. And I think we're heading towards a body politic that tries to encourage that. I'm looking forward to that. I think that we have a lot of conflicts right now about that. And there's a lot of people that want to kind of have their own stake and maintain their piece of the pie, that kind of thing. And I think that kind of philosophy, fortunately, is going more by the wayside. And I am hoping for a world that more tries to take care of its fellows rather than leave them to pull themselves up by their bootstraps, which, if you understand physics, is actually an impossibility. So, to that end, I have noted when I do have money, I tend to be more generous. Unfortunately, I tend to bargain in experience more than I bargain in cash or currency. So I often don't have very much money, actual money with me, but I have a lot of experience. And I think I benefit more from that for understanding humanity in that regard. And I try to be generous with my care and concern for my fellows rather than in actual currency. But I try to do that as well when I have it. So I guess that would be my commentary on it in general. And thank you for giving me the chance to speak.
Thank you, Jeff. Marianne, is your hand still raised? Yeah, why don't you wrap things up for us, Marianne?
Real quickly, two quick things. My grandmother taught me generosity. If she had a sweater on that I liked, she'd take it off and give it to me. She was a poor immigrant family who married up. She was just that way. Whatever you liked, she would give away. She'd say, give it away, and then it lives on. My mother was the one that set the example of giving by doing. We didn't have a lot of extra money, but mother always did something for someone at all time. If anybody needed something, she would get them groceries, or she would help them out or give them a ride. She was a foster care, a social worker. She gave by doing, and that set me a tremendous, tremendous example. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. The exercise in Wellspring, I think, was intended to get us all to think about generosity, but also to get us to learn a little bit more about each other. And I think some of that happened this morning as well. So it's an interesting exercise, and maybe we'll continue the discussion further on down the road.